We are here to talk about Pulumi, and the name of this talk is called Pulumi Up because that's the command you run to start to deploy your resources with Pulumi. The subtext of this is like why your project team would be better off with an infrastructure as code solution. So just to go over what we're going to talk about, what is infrastructure as code? What problems does it solve? And then why Pulumi? Why did we choose this as our preferred method of handling this? And then we're going to go into how we use it at Differential, and then we'll have kind of a live demo. So to start off, what is infrastructure as code? We're kind of talking about levels of infrastructure. And so the way that most teams do this, and the bare bones way to do this would be that you can go into the AWS console and set up all of your infrastructure resources manually. And obviously, that is kind of the simple way to do it. That's kind of the way that they want you to do it. But it can be time consuming and also it's not scalable. So, level one here is what AWS kind of offers this with CloudFormation, but infrastructure is configuration. So they kind of offer these tools that will allow you to configure what you want things to look like and will help the scalability issue, but not necessarily all the way. And so what we have with level two is this infrastructure as code, which is an abstraction over level one. So what are the advantages to doing infrastructure as code? You can have it in your language. You're not having to learn something new. All of our Pulumi infrastructure is written in JavaScript. So any developer at Differential who's working on another project could look at our code and make sense of it. It's not completely learned from scratch situation, which is great. Well architected constructs can store configuration rules. So you can kind of build your own constructs and have it keep these rules consistent throughout different resources. So if I have three different RDS databases, I can actually use a similar construct to keep them all in the same version. I can keep them all with the same configurations. And it's easy to change that if I need to. And then I think the real kind of like killer feature is that constructs can take inputs from other constructs and secrets management is handled. So this kind of takes away a lot of the manual configuration with secrets management that you deal with something like Heroku, where, I definitely can recall times where I've had to spin up a new environment on Heroku and have to figure out all the environment variables and put them all in manually. And when you have 20 or 30 different things that you're trying to carry over, it can be a huge pain. So this handles all that for you. It keeps it in your repo. It keeps it encrypted, so it's secure. That's just kind of the infrastructure advantages. Marcelo, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I think another important thing to understand as well is like, as Brandon was talking about the different levels of infrastructure management, level zero being you're getting in and doing your UI. Level one, you're using these configuration files to try to figure out how to make things a little bit more consistent. Then level two, finally kind of like bringing it all together. All those levels are still like it's all backwards compatible, right? So level two can leverage level one can obviously leverage level zero, right? And Lumi also has these like awesome functions that you can use to make sure that any changes are always coming back into the code and being reflected in the code. I think another advantage as well is that because you're keeping everything in code now, including the way that different constructs are connected, not only is it easier for any developer to understand how data is flowing, but you can also see any changes that are going to happen before you actually deploy them to multiple people, right? So that's all I've got to add.
Yep. Yep. Very good. And so next is why did we choose Pulumi? It is a level two solution. It has great state management. So just what Marcel was talking about with being able to look at a snapshot of your deployed resources and see the changes before they get deployed to see what's actually going to change when you actually deploy it. As I was talking about before, secrets management with Pulumi is really, really powerful and really, really great. It offers a lot of pre-built constructs to reduce complexity instead of having to build the constructs yourself. If I want a RDS database, I can go into what Pulumi provides in their library, and it will spin up the database. It will spin up all the affiliated resources that the database needs. The last one is, I think it's easy to configure with our continuous delivery pipelines. So they actually just came out with some custom integrations with being able to attach it to pull requests and have it deploy your code just to make sure that nothing is going to break. That's really, really powerful for just kind of automation and keeping all of our resources in sync.
Yeah, and to add on a little bit to that, I feel like you could think of Pulumi kind of like the React of infrastructure, right? Because like in React, it's very easy to manage state in like siloed areas, and to pass variables through a bunch of different places and see everything reflected on changes, right? And so with Pulumi, you can kind of do the same. It's just you don't have the same kind of DOM classes, right? Like you still have your constructs are represented in classes. They can also be represented in functions and a bunch of different like things, right? And any variables that they produce, any data that they produce, they can be very easily shared with other components of your Pulumi stack. The moment you start being able to grab outputs from infrastructure constructs and putting them somewhere else, like that's where you're like, wow, this is amazing. Like I don't even have to look at this password anymore, right?
Yep. You put it in the config file once, and you don't have to think about it ever again because it's basically stored in as a variable. So it's pretty great. I also want to go through why wouldn't you want to use Pulumi? I think that there are definitely good reasons to use it. There are good reasons not to use it. The learning curve obviously being very high. I think there's probably a lot of people on this call where this will completely just like fly over your head, and it did for me the first time. So I definitely relate to that. I think that once you start to figure out how to use it and work with it with production resources, it becomes easier to understand, but there's definitely a learning curve there that can make it not a good investment of time and developer resources.
Essentially, there it's like because of the very high learning curve, you are going to end up first wanting to learn more about infrastructure and all of the different components that are available in AWS and Azure and Google. And then you're going to want to learn how to like bring it into Pulumi. During that journey, you're still learning a lot and you don't necessarily know exactly how to do things correctly. So your first pass will probably not be great. And then your second pass is going to improve, right? But you're going to notice so many things can be improved after your first pass that you're going to want to make that extra time for refinement.
It's definitely a time suck. And I think the third thing is just developer frustration. I can definitely speak to that quite a bit with just things not working the way that you want it to work the first time. And sometimes it is easier just to go the way that AWS designed you to do and go into the AWS console and build all your things. It is worth doing it for the scalability aspect. So knowing that once I figured out how to do it, I won't have to figure out how to do it again. It's a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah,
I think that, yeah.
And speaking to the frustration part too, because of the way that Pulumi works, you're essentially leveraging all of the infrastructure providers' APIs. And those APIs aren't perfect, right? They can have issues with how they connect with each other. So a lot of the frustration that you run into when you're developing with Pulumi is that there are certain pieces that when you try to sometimes roll back, will maybe not roll back or will not get destroyed properly. The process of editing constructs can sometimes just like put you kind of in a corner where you have to get into the UI and get things fixed manually. Once you've figured it out, it's like, okay, I'm never going to have to deal with this again. Jordan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've used Terraform before, which is, for people who don't know, it's similar to Pulumi. And another gotcha for Pulumi and Terraform and the like could be if you're constantly working both in AWS console and then also Pulumi. Because what you could do is you could overwrite something you did in the console that Pulumi doesn't know about the next time you commit something through Pulumi. So you have to be mindful of when you're working in the console when you have Pulumi already set up.
Yep. My kind of rule of thumb is I stay out of the console unless I absolutely need to, because yeah, it's so easy to mess things up. And actually we had an issue with one of our domains got manually created somewhere else, and we ended up having like duplicates and stuff, and it caused an outage for us. That was something that could have been fixed by keeping things closer in order and not doing things manually. So Ames has a question too. He asks in the chat, what size and type of projects are ideal for Pulumi? What queues would suggest the juice is worth the squeeze? Marcelo, do you want to take a stab at that?
I would say there's two big reasons you would really want to use Pulumi. The main one really is if you know that your infrastructure is going to be complex. So more than just one server or one cluster. Every customer has a different level of configuration, and that configuration modifies your like core infrastructure. So managing that in some programmatic way is very important.
Yeah.
So that's like the complex side. But in the simple side, if you say that you do only want to have one server, maybe one S3 bucket or something like that, the biggest value there is that server is going to be built up in, like it should use a construct that has already passed some sort of security check. So the security configuration can be shared.
The other thing that I want to bring up too is that when we build products, we tend to start a product by building locally and running everything locally. And then you kind of think about the deployment things and infrastructure at the end when you start to pass it to a customer and get it into kind of a production state. So the next thing, Marcelo, you want to talk about security?
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that using constructs can make for more secure constructs and more secure infrastructure. Even the configuration of a cluster, as basic as it may be in the beginning, with time you end up adding different tools to ensure that your network is always secure. And that can be, like logging. How do you configure logging such that PII isn't reflected in that logging, for example? So the idea here is we could create constructs that are secure, right? And then we can also create policies that are secured. And so what we refer to policies are like all of these infrastructure providers allow you to limit the way that some things are created within the account. For example, like a good rule in AWS at least is that you want to have all of your users in user groups and then provide different roles to the user group and not specifically to the user, right? So then it gives you just more powerful control over a specific role, and it just makes it easier to share access. So you'd be able to very easily grab a construct that creates that rule, and when that rule is not met, it will like error in the actual like AWS console, or it will error in your actual stack. So those are the two ways that Pulumi can make us just more secure overall from a technical perspective.
And then we also just want to talk about some key learnings that we've gone through as we've been able to start to scale this on projects. So, keep your configs in one place, being able to have all of our configurations in one folder on ease has been really helpful in terms of keeping track of changes and keeping track of what our stacks look like. Build your own constructs as functions.
Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed fairly early on, because we had to create a custom construct ourselves, is that Pulumi comes with a construct class and you extend from it. And that construct class, basically what it does is it kind of opens up a bunch of hooks inside of the construct so that you can specifically identify what to do when something is being created, updated, removed, read, or even like how to detect a difference, right, in configuration. If you're integrating a construct directly with a service, but for the most part, you can just use other constructs to create what you need. And it's a whole lot easier to avoid the base Pulumi construct and extending that and just create a function that leverages all of the constructs that are already in Pulumi to create what you want to create. But essentially, what we learned is just the only reason you should be building a real construct is if you're integrating directly with a service that does not have their own set of constructs already available.
And that's kind of the next one too. Have a directory for stacks. I guess that's kind of what I was talking about with the configs one. And then invest time in understanding the cloud architecture and that lies under the code. Just being able to understand what is this actually doing when I deploy it and what's it actually creating is really important. And then invest time in understanding Pulumi outputs. I think they can be really powerful because then you can share things between different stacks and you can have things that are shared between different projects, but kind of the outputs mechanism is how all of that is enabled. So it's good to understand that. So let's talk about ease. And so we use Pulumi on ease to manage our resources across different airports. The way that we have it set up is each airport has their own set of stacks, which are just kind of a stack being a set of configurations. And so each airport has a dev stack, a staging stack, and a release stack, which is they all have the airport's configuration. It's just a matter of what kind of data that we have with it. We don't want to touch the release stack unless something needs to be fixed or we actually want to release code out into production. If we're doing local development, ideally we'd be using the dev stack with mock data or the staging stack if we want to test how things look with production data. And then we keep our configurations within that. For example, we have a namespace here where you can just add specific information about an airport. Auth0, we have all of our kind of Auth0 keys and URLs and all that fun stuff that we have to have in its own place. And we have a server one that is where we define all of our environment variables that goes to our API construct. And we also have a global stack that will deploy all of the global resources that we have. So here's our stacks. Here's what we use it to manage. We use it to do databases. So all of our data is stored on AWS, which is managed by Pulumi. All of our apps, our Ease app is our API and client are both running on AWS. And then all of our ingestion engine, we use email addresses that deposit into S3 buckets, which then kick off Lambda functions, which puts data in our database. And all of those pieces are all on AWS, all managed by Pulumi. And then another cool thing is we do have an external integration already with DN Simple, which is our DNS provider. So basically we can have it create subdomains for us and subdomain records on DN Simple site using this same thing. And then obviously secret management with all of Pulumi's config, which is also great. Let's take some questions.
Yeah, this is awesome. I had a question. I've only worked with level 1 IC before, and like it's easy to differentiate between your code and your infrastructure. Is there like anything you have to do to keep those separated so they're not too tightly coupled? Or is that just something that happens with Pulumi? Like, would it be very hard to switch to another level 2 infrastructure as code provider?
So with Pulumi, so for example, you can use CloudFormation templates inside of Pulumi, right? So that's how you can kind of like wrap, like if you've already used level 1 and you already have those components built, you would essentially run their importing functions to bring that in and then leverage it. But are you referring to like changing from a Pulumi to something else that's competing against Pulumi?
Yeah. Like, what if
Yeah.
Pulumi went debunked in 2 years? Not saying it will, but
Yeah.
like, if we had to switch off of
Yeah.
it, would that be a huge problem?
I don't think it would be a huge problem. If that were to happen, the other level 2 provider would have some way to import what's already built in. But I think you would probably end up doing something like, well, you'd have to change your constructs to some degree to match whatever the new libraries are in the new level 2, and then run their command to bring everything in.
Okay.
Right. And that was something that we kind of dealt with when we moved ease onto Pulumi. Was we already had a bunch of things on AWS, all the lambdas and stuff were already on there. And so we used Pulumi's import command to pull in the configuration of those resources. Worked moderately well. Pulumi's was not great experience with that. Great question though.
There's another question too. Let's see. It says, how might we prevent silos and bottlenecks, especially with junior developers, on getting them up to speed on the cloud and tools we use while also learning Pulumi?
Yeah, I think that's a really good consideration. We definitely, once I started leveling up on ease, we had to bring everyone else in on it to an extent. And I think that, the thing that worked well with us on ease was just doing it gradually and not getting too in the weeds with it. Like Brian, you could probably speak to that more than anyone because you were kind of my guinea pig as far as that. But I think that the hardest part is getting it working conceptually in your head more than anything else, of just like what's going on when you actually do a deploy and what is it actually doing. Once you kind of grasp that, it becomes clearer, and I think it's easier to level up on.
Yeah, I feel like the biggest bottleneck is always maybe the lack of like knowledge in the actual infrastructure providers, right? Because you might know very well how to use AWS, but you might not know Azure, and you might require Azure for a specific thing. And some constructs are similar, but they're not the same.
Yeah.
They do vary across different providers.
And even then, it's like most developers, when you're learning how to be a developer, you're learning how to run a server and how to run a web app and all that. Like that's kind of like the lowest level you get to as far as the actual deployment is concerned. And then you just, oh, hey, what's the easiest to deploy? It's Heroku. Okay, just do 2 commands and things on Heroku. And so it's kind of a matter of you have to learn what's in the black box there before you can really be effective with it. But there's definitely going to be a learning curve there.
Although I feel like it's helpful too when you get to see the inside of constructs that are already doing what you want them to do. So for example, that service construct that we shared with ease was basically just like it was a very boilerplate construct that was setting up a Dockerized, like Heroku style deployment. And I mean, we ended up having to just copy paste it in because there was so much more that we wanted to do with that construct. We wanted to extend it a lot more to get it to work properly with the domains and stuff. So I feel like had we not had that work before, and starting from scratch would have been a much longer journey just to figure out how to connect the cluster to the VPC, to the network, and how to expose all the listeners and all of that stuff that's actually going on.
The underlying things that generally you don't have to think about when you're deploying your app to something like Heroku, where it handles all of that for you.
Yep. So it looks like we've got another question. Assemble org-wide Pulumi resource doc and people to reach out to for help. Jordan, do you want to?
Is that just a suggestion for?
Yeah, that was just, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Yeah, like what I ran into with kind of similarly to what I brought up before of people working in the console versus people using the infrastructure as code, is it's usually easier for especially juniors to learn via the console with the interface and everything.
Yeah.
And then they get comfortable with that. And then they don't really understand the connection that like Pulumi does and what it serves. And then if they need to make a change, they might just naturally go to the console, right? Where first it's like you want to educate them on both, but also level them up with Pulumi, but understand what Pulumi is doing, right? And actually understand what changes occur. And if something breaks with Pulumi, then what do they turn to, right?
Yep. All right. Well, I think we're at 1 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing. But thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.